Okay, welcome back, everyone. I'm Yves Dejaeghere. I'm the director of the Federation for Innovation in Democracy, for Innovation in Democracy Europe, and we are also co-founders of this network. I'm delighted to have two papers to present to you, two great papers, looking at two very important aspects of climate assemblies. First of all, the impact. What does it actually achieve? Both impact and legacy, so two different aspects. This paper will be presented by Daniel Thorman, who is a research associate at the Center for Climate and Social Transformation at Cardiff University. He will present a paper he wrote together with Stuart Capstick from the same institute at Cardiff University. And then we will have a paper looking at the legitimacy or the perceived legitimacy of climate assemblies and the resonance these assemblies can have to the wider public, those outside of the room. And this is a paper that will be presented later by Alina Averchenkova, who is lead for governance and legislation at the Grantham Research Institute on climate change at the London School of Economics. That will be a paper she wrote together with Oisin, Dorota Stasiak, and Azukena Moro, of the Institute of Advanced Sustainability Studies in Berlin. So I will first give the floor to Daniel Thorman. I want to remind everybody about the Jamboard. There is a link you can see that's just been posted in the chat. As we noticed, there can be a bit of a maximum capacity problem there. Just refresh or try to go back later and you will get on. If not, post your remarks and questions in the chat. But we will switch then to Alina Averchenkova. So on the topic of legitimacy and resonance of climate assemblies. Alina, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, depending on where you're joining us. And I'm going to talk to you about legitimacy and resonance of climate assemblies, the topic which has actually already come quite a bit in the previous discussion. So why do we care about legitimacy and resonance? I think from the public policy making perspective, climate assemblies and citizens assemblies in general are often seen as an instrument to either legitimize or increase public support for a particular policy option, or to get social mandate for policymakers to actually introduce climate policies. And oftentimes in the deliberative democracy debate, citizens assemblies are seen as one way of making up for deficits in democratic legitimacy and increasing trust in public policy. So what we've done in our paper, we have done a rapid review, literature review, both looking at the broader deliberative democracy debate, but also specifically on the experience with climate assemblies. And we have also conducted several explorative interviews with experts who participated in running climate assemblies to date. And would like to share some preliminary conclusions out of that review as input to the debate on what we already know and what we still need to know on legitimacy and resonance of climate assemblies. So legitimacy of climate assemblies is central for their effectiveness, because unless they are perceived as legitimate and unless the wider public actually knows about them, they're not likely to have the impacts and meet the objectives that I've just set out. However, what the literature shows is that citizens' assemblies cannot be seen as a blanket solution to address lack of trust in the government institutions. And I think that links to some of the questions which were raised before. So it's one of the tools in a toolkit that we have, but it's not an answer to every challenge we have around climate policies. However, citizens' assembly do have a great potential to bridge a gap between those who govern on climate and those who are governed, and to build trust in climate policies. And I'll talk a little bit about how they can do that in a minute. What we also find is that climate assemblies are more likely to resonate and to gain support from a wider public in a political context that is not characterized by too much antagonism. And here an interesting example is the abandonment of Climate Citizens Assembly in Australia, where a very politicized and divisive political discussion actually led to Citizens Assembly not succeeding, not coming to fruition. So when we think about legitimacy of climate assemblies and citizens assembly in general, academic literature has approached this question from two angles. One, studies that look at normative legitimacy, addressing the questions to what extent mini-public, a small selection of citizens, actually can represent the norms and opinions of a broader public. However, most of the studies on legitimacy so far have followed procedural legitimacy approach, which looks at characteristics of the citizens' assembly in terms of the process, ensuring representativeness, selection of citizens through random selection methods, inclusiveness, where random selection is combined with additional criteria to ensure representation of different socioeconomic groups, sometimes gender, education levels, and in certain cases, for example, in the UK, also diversity in terms of attitudes to climate change. Impartiality, in terms of independence of conduct of the assembly, are very important methods of moderation that actually bring all of the participants to the table, and also transparency of the process. So in other ways, sometimes this is referred to as input legitimacy of the process. The second factor that determines whether a citizens' assembly is considered legitimate is its governance structure. And I think Frederick and others mentioned earlier on that independence of the convener of the assembly is very important in this sense, but also perception of thematic competence being there. And here in particular, how expert inputs are drawn into the assembly becomes a very central question. And some climate assemblies in the past have established expert advisory boards as a way to deal with that. But the governance structure should also balance this different elements with efficiency consideration and ensure that it doesn't become too cumbersome and the process is actually flexible and responsive in the context and when assembly is being run. And thirdly, the other element of legitimacy of the citizens' assembly is actually determined by external factors. To what extent the output of the assembly is actually accepted by the general public depends on whether the assembly responds to the needs of the public and of the political process. And I think we had that discussion in the previous section, to what extent the outcomes and recommendations of the assemblies are integrated into the policy cycle, and to what extent actually the assembly is visible and resonates with the wider public. So looking at what other climate assemblies so far have done in respect to ensuring legitimacy, we find that all of the national climate assemblies so far used random selection backed up by diversity criteria to ensure inclusiveness and representativeness. There have been very rigorous procedures to ensure transparency for selection of topics. Those procedures were clearly communicated by all climate assemblies, and also to be very transparent on the selection of expertise. There have been different approaches to the independence of the convener, where France, for example, went for an independent third-party convener, while Ireland, for example, still had some involvement of civil service, in Denmark as well. In terms of degrees of integration into policy cycle, that was mentioned before, there are quite different approaches, with some assemblies being very clear on how the output will be dealt with, while others less so. Now, in terms of resonance, it's not enough for the assembly to have procedures that are perceived as transparent and legitimate. To actually get impact in the wider society, citizens actually need to know about the assembly, And also studies show that the support for the assembly increases when the public sees participants just like themselves. And in that sense, experience shows that having diverse voices and communication around climate assembly helps strengthen both legitimacy and resonance of the assemblies. And information sharing alone, just simply putting out what is happening, is not enough to ensure resonance. There needs to be an active engagement strategy, and that strategy needs resources. And finally, just to emphasize the point that was made earlier, that processes that are supported by government, deliberative processes, or supported by interest groups, and where there is some level of institutionalization, they actually get better attention, greater attention from the media and from the general public. So in terms of concrete strategies, we see from the existing climate assemblies in terms of engaging broader public, all of the assemblies have had a public website. However, the intensity and content of communication varied quite a lot between different national climate assemblies. Some have been, like in France, have been holding trainings for the media ahead of the assembly and targeted press conferences, and also sessions with editors of leading newspapers, where others have taken more passive approach of issuing press releases and not really engaging very much with media. And very quick analysis of media coverage, we couldn't do a very in-depth study, but just a quick assessment shows that mostly that is done consistent with media coverage that the assemblies have received, with those who invested more getting more attention. Interestingly, Ireland and France have used the approach of allowing public submissions to engage wider public into the Citizens' Assembly. But the important point here is it's necessary to have a very clear plan on how to deal with those submissions and how to integrate them back into the Citizens' Assembly process. Engaging youth and also employing creative outreach strategies such as using film, cartoons, art exhibitions to communicate around climate assembly have also been approaches used so far. So to conclude, what can we learn from this rapid review of available knowledge? Well, it is very clear that legitimacy and resonance needs to be considered at the design stage of the Citizens' Assembly. And they need to be, this consideration needs to be integrated into the remit, as discussed earlier on, the framing, selection of experts, evidence base. And a very important challenge, which remains a critical one, is still how to ensure legitimacy of input and balanced representation of views, specifically in relation to climate change, and how to make sure that the debate is not seen as being driven by experts, as we discussed in the previous session. What we found is that in all of the climate assemblies held up to date, concerns around legitimacy are the main grounds for the critiques to attack the outcomes of climate assembly. So this is really a central challenge to look at. It is important to ensure communication and engagement strategy and resources for the Citizens' Assembly on climate change. And finally, as climate assemblies should be combined with other forms of deliberative participation. As we said, it's not one size fits all and not an answer to all of the problems. And I'll just leave you with this final thought that refers to the point that Yves raised in the previous discussion. There is no, while we can see some of the strategies that assemblies are deploying, we see key issues that need to be considered, but there is no universal recipe for gaining legitimacy and resonance. It very much depends on the political, institutional, and cultural context. Therefore, it's very important for Citizens' Assembly to learn from each other, but then to adapt those learning to the local conditions. Thank you so much.
With no further ado, Daniel, thank you. You have the floor now.
Right. Okay. So yeah, thanks. And I guess though, to sort of signpost that there's, I guess, a fair amount of kind of crossover with everything that we've talked about before, but I think it'll be useful to talk about how working towards new definitions of what impact is and delineating between impact and legacy might help us to sort of frame and plan the climate assemblies in order to kind of maximize outputs towards these different goals. So yeah, thanks as well to Stuart Capstick, who was involved in writing the paper that this presentation is based on. So that paper was produced by performing a rapid evidence review, kind of like a quick systematic literature review on climate assemblies specifically, and then some relevant literature that had a specific focus on the impact and legacy of citizens' assemblies. So we looked at different ways that these papers sort of define it in the literature and what they kind of see as some of the key agenda issues. So the impact and legacy range from these kind of more immediate and specific impacts. They're often referred to as kind of concrete policy recommendations, whether that's kind of something that's implemented by government or something that's kind of the result of the discursive process and the deliberation. Through to the kind of longer term and more wide-ranging legacies, which we'll look at in a little bit more detail, but for example, might be a kind of heightened awareness of climate change around a population, or the kind of institutionalization of deliberative methods, as other people have kind of spoken about as well. Another thing, I guess, to kind of make people aware of, as I'm sure you are, I guess it's kind of difficult to look at longer term impacts of citizens' assemblies in retrospect, when they're a relatively recent phenomenon, and I guess the years after the implementation of these methods, they might become a little bit clearer. So looking directly at the impacts of climate deliberation, as I've said, these are kind of more kind of short-term outcomes, and generally focus on this kind of generation or refinement of policy. Often kind of focused on overcoming a kind of democratic deficit within kind of governance and within populations, and often this kind of justification for policy implementation. Over and beyond those kind of like policy orientated impacts, there can also be impacts on participants themselves. So how much they kind of change their perspectives and perceptions of climate change, or indeed deliberative processes. They can generate attention from other influential bodies, such as the CCC in the UK. So these bodies might kind of want to use some of the findings to legitimize or justify their own policy recommendations, and kind of contextualize them within that. And also this kind of focus on a heightened kind of media attention, which might be engaging with media officers, for example, and reporting on the kind of procedure and occurrence of the climate assembly itself. Where this might kind of differentiate when we sort of think about legacy might be what the kind of longer lasting effects that these are. And from the literature, we kind of noticed that these are not typically planned or built into the processes themselves, whereby the impacts probably come under aims and objectives of the climate assembly itself. Some of the legacy issues are kind of seen as something that are sort of a reflection and a kind of added bonus. And we would argue that considering these at planning stages, as other people have said as well, is going to be key and crucial to that. This might be, as I said, there was impact on the participants and how they change their mind. We might also want to impact public perceptions outside of that pool of small participants, and create a kind of momentum for civil society interest. And then this kind of institutionalization of climate deliberative methods. So just the fact that it's being used and being publicized has this kind of opportunity for democratic transformation, which I think was a really interesting part of the conversation we were having before the break, where there's this potential to kind of overcome some of the power dynamics that exist within democratic governance and within models of democracy that we kind of operationalize within society. One of the ways that we did this that might be useful for the kind of development of a framework was to use some of Andy Sterling's definitions and a kind of typology. And these are kind of three different sort of forms of impact and legacy. So we might have a normative approach, which is that it's just the right thing to do, is to involve people in these decisions and this policy. It's instrumental, so it achieves a particular end. There's a kind of goal in sight, a specific reason for doing it. And then substantive impact and legacy, which is that it leads to better outcomes itself. So a few examples of these might be the normative is kind of this focus on inclusivity and widespread democratic representation, bridging this gap between policymakers. Instrumental is something that I kind of talked about before, where we're kind of justifying and legitimizing policy. So some examples of that from the UK here, where banning the sale of petrol and diesel cars was something that was kind of already on the policy agenda, but can be sort of legitimized and pushed forward as something that's publicly acceptable. And then substantive is where we might sort of have new and more ambitious and radical opportunities for change that emerge from the deliberative process, which might not necessarily have arrived at otherwise. Some of the examples of sort of challenging fossil fuel lobbies and things like that. And I guess it can also cross over these boundaries. So there might be a kind of normative engagement, which might raise the profile with lots more people being involved. And there's research that we sort of looked at as well that found that when people were presented with policy options that they were told were the result of deliberative methods, they were received more positively by the public. So some of the recommendations might be that there's a kind of formal commitment a priori to the Climate Assembly from the commissioning bodies, that they're going to make a public commitment or at least response to the outcomes. Engage in a variety of different actors, whether that's kind of the public representatives or media, business. There's examples where business have been involved and they're kind of on board. There's this kind of buy-in from the different bodies that are involved, and then striving to kind of maximize these impacts that might, there's this risk of this kind of expert-led approach just reproducing mainstream policy and encouraging more citizen-led participation. So just briefly, I guess, recognizing that there's value of considering the differences between impact and legacy and wanting to kind of push those up the agenda at the commissioning stage, and designing pathways to the dissemination of the process itself beyond the actual occurrence, to making plans for how we might move forward and contextualize the findings of that, and broadly the kind of need for public engagement with these issues outside of that kind of closed assembly process to initiate policy responses. So yeah, that's everything from me, and I would invite questions to both myself and I think Stuart's happy to join in with the discussion as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel. I will first give the floor to Oisin Coghlan. Always a challenge to pronounce Irish names. Hi, I hope I did that well. So Oisin is the director of Friends of the Earth of Ireland already for over a decade. He co-founded the Stop Climate Chaos Coalition in 2007 and led an 8-year campaign for a climate change law. So a good person to have on this topic in the room. He was also a witness of the Citizens' Assembly in Ireland that looked at the issue of climate change in Ireland. And so, Oisin, please, we'd like to hear your thoughts on these two very interesting papers. Thank you.
Thanks, Yves. It's really great to be with you and to be at this first gathering of Knoca. I think it's just firstly to say, as someone who's worked on climate policy for 15 years or more now, it's really exciting to see this fusion of academic research and expert research with practice because we need all the tools we can get to instigate more climate action. And yes, we had a really interesting experience here in Ireland, which just touched on those two papers with the Citizens Assembly that ran in 2017 into 2018. And so we're in a bit of a position now to judge what the legacy of that is over the last 4 years. And there was an awful lot in both Alina's paper and Daniel's paper that resonates with our experience here. And I'll just touch on a few of those in the next couple of minutes. I mean, one key thing for me that triggered a lot of my own thoughts was Alina's remark that they're one tool that we can use to work on climate. And it's definitely the case that just as there's no silver bullets for the actual policies to reduce emissions, there's no one silver bullet for how we progress from a state of inadequate action or inertia in the political and policy system to one where there's the beginnings of the kinds of actions we need. And my main reflection on the situation in Ireland was that the Citizens Assembly unlocked the potential for political decision making on climate, but it didn't create it from zero. So it was a tool, it was a lever, but to quote Archimedes, if you give me somewhere to stand with my lever, I can move the earth. So where you're standing is really essential, like what the existing conditions are when the assembly is meeting, and indeed afterwards, are important. So I know in Ireland, reflecting on that experience, there was a couple of things that were essential. One was, I would say this, wouldn't I, but a strong civil society movement and pressure around climate action that was there before, during, and afterwards. But even more significantly, coming from that and from other things, a recognition by the political elites that action was required. As in, if they had come into this thinking this is just a way to kick action down the road and not to do it, well, then there'd be no guarantee that the legacy would have been substantial, and the legacy has been substantial. So you need that recognition in the first instance, some commitment, as Daniel mentioned, by political leaders that they will engage at least with the outcome of the assembly, and then a clear path from the outcome of the assembly. Again, Daniel mentioned this. To policy change or policy decision making. And actually in the Irish Assembly we have a kind of a controlled experiment in that there was 3 topics under consideration by the same assembly: abortion, that most people know was doing that, the climate change, and in between the issue of the aging society. The issue of abortion led to a constitutional referendum and a change in our laws. And in the climate one, I'll talk about a bit more, it has led to substantial action. But the middle one, everyone's entirely forgotten about. Nothing came in terms of legacy from the Citizens Assembly, the same people working on the challenges of an aging society, because there wasn't political recognition that anything particular needed to happen in the first place. I thought it was a crisis situation that needed an intervention, and there wasn't a strong civil society movement around it, and there wasn't a clear path. So in the case of abortion, they guaranteed that a parliamentary committee would take it up. They didn't guarantee that with the other 2. We campaigned for our issue to get the same treatment by Parliament as the abortion issue had, and succeeded. And then that deliberative process in Parliament of an all-party committee actually led to as much of the legacy as the Assembly itself did. And actually looking back now, kind of from the benefit, because that was 2018, the report of the Assembly came out. 2019, the report of the parliamentary committee came out, and we've been working on the results since. That looking back, the Assembly's output has been seen more as a mandate rather than the specific proposals they made. It was a recognition that, as was the case with abortion, that the public was far beyond where the politicians thought they were and was ready for action, ready for change. And it was taken in that vein more than the specific proposals. So that was really crucial. And I would say then, and I know I want to hand back over to you, that one of the things that Knoca might consider looking at as we move forward is examining in more detail, what are those conditions that make this the right tool to choose? When is the Citizens Assembly the right answer? And specifically then, what supports are required from civil society, from philanthropic funders, from the parliamentary system, from whatever, to make sure you get the most out of the investment of time and energy and citizens' time as well into a climate assembly, because unless we have those, unless we choose it, if we always choose it, it won't work in lots of times. And if we choose it in the wrong circumstance, as Daniel pointed out, it might actually reinforce existing policy and not create the opening you require. They tried to do subnational ones here of a kind afterwards, didn't have the same support structure or the same purpose around it, and they didn't really produce anything. So it does require more ongoing reflection as to what are the particular conditions and the particular supports that mean you get meaningful outcomes. And just to say, in case it hasn't been clear, we had a much more significant climate action plan after the Assembly than before. And just last week, our lower house of Parliament passed a really substantial climate law modelled on the UK Act. That 8-year campaign I was told, you mentioned in my biography, was to get an act that wasn't half as good as the UK. Since the 4 years of the Climate Assembly, we now have a new act that almost law in the next couple of weeks that is far more robust and fit for purpose than anything we had before. And the Citizens' Assembly, although it didn't specifically look for those particular changes, laid the ground for that cultural shift, along with all the campaigning that the school strikers and the likes of us have done in the last few years.
I will immediately maybe open the floor to Daniel and Alina. There is the urgency. How do you avoid, and I think in the case of paper one, to be seen as too instrumental, if we look at the three elements, Daniel, that you highlight in your paper.
Sure.
How do you balance it?
Yeah, I think part of the process of being transparent about what the different forms of impact and legacy are will really help to kind of increase the trustworthiness of the whole process itself. I think there can be often this problem whereby if looking at the kind of instrumental, as you say, which is kind of policy orientated, often there'll be a kind of a legitimizing of that policy to say that it's the result of a normative and citizen-led climate assembly. And I think being sort of planning that there might be different forms of outcomes at the early stages and sort of projecting that there's different forms of impact, different forms of legacy will allow us to kind of retrospectively look back and say, which are the issues that were normative? How have we resulted in some substantive outcomes? How has their instrumental input into the policy cycle? So I think it's about recognizing that there are different forms of that impact and legacy, and being transparent about how you plan for them, and then how you kind of communicate that in the retrospectively.
Alina, do you want to add something to Eva's question?
Oh, perhaps just very briefly picking up on what Oisin actually said in his comments. I think this also links to what is the appropriate remit for the Assembly, depending on where the country is in terms of its policy cycle. Are we trying to generate social mandate for climate policy making, and therefore what would then be the appropriate question that the Citizens' Assembly can tackle without going into too technical levels of expertise? Or are we actually getting approval for the particular policy proposals? So I think these are the questions that we need to consider in relation to, I think, the point that Eva raised. But I fully agree, this is actually the key question to tackle. And at least in our paper, the evidence we have looked at, we actually identified that this is a clear research gap, specifically looking at in more details how different climate assemblies address that kind of ex post, but also ex ante from the kind of more positive analysis of what could be strategies that we can pick up from other policy areas. I think that is definitely something Knoca could look at in more details going forward.
Okay, thank you. Please keep putting questions in the chat. I saw a question from Laurie Moulton Ulrich. I don't know if you want to pose your question yourself, or I take it from the chat. If so, you can unmute. And it's spurred a bit of a discussion within the chat. So what is the current assessment of the impact of the French Citizen Assembly? And I think this is a big question we all get when presenting it. And I will immediately take a bit from the chat, the discussion that ensued, the difference with the perception of the UK one, where we could say it had less impact, most people might agree, but is less perceived as a failure. So Daniel or Alina, do you want to come into, so what is the current assessment of impact of the French Citizen Assembly for you, given to date refusal of politicians to take any of the recommended actions? So this perception of the French CA as being, what is your current assessment of that? And how do you see that in the framework of what you did for your papers?
I think just kind of linking it with one of the other questions about Chris Short said here about kind of governments being obsessed with maintaining this control of events and policies. I think that's, you know, clearly what is part of that narrative with the French Assembly, and illustrates a difficulty that is worth exploring, that we kind of propose in the paper, whereby I think it was the paper from Peter Bryant that says that perhaps one of the most useful ways to engage with the climate assemblies is this kind of reorientation of power away from governments. And I think linking back with one of the presentations earlier, where saying that there's a kind of an independent body that commissions these climate assemblies, but then to say that the politicians and the governments themselves have to respond to that, kind of establishes that they're not necessarily setting the agenda, but do have to respond to these issues, which might be a way around what's happened in France, whereby there's no need for them to kind of act upon them.
Alina, you want to add something to that?
Sure, I'll go very quick. I see Liz has a hand and she is the best qualified to comment on that question. But in terms of our assessment, looking specifically at legacy and resonance aspects, the French case clearly shows that, you know, the Macron's promise up front, and also his participation, well, his appearance at the assembly itself, has helped to amplify the publicity and visibility of the assembly. So in terms of amplifying resonance, that was definitely positive. Of course, you know, the media coverage post factum, once some of the recommendations haven't been picked up, also generated quite a lot of attention, but more in a negative space. In terms of legacy, legitimacy, sorry, upfront, it also created the expectation of the process being more legitimate. I think the detrimental effect is mainly to be seen in the longer term impact and in the trust among the French public into such deliberative processes in the future. So I think that is still something remains to be seen. But just to mention, I've been part of parliamentary discussions where parliamentarians from France would actually cite Citizens' Assembly and the outcomes as the key factor in the newly adopted climate law. So from that perspective, I think the overall impact is still, for me, of the French Assembly is very positive. Thanks.
Okay, Lise, you wanted to intervene?
Yes, and maybe it's not for me to say, and sorry, my name is Lise Deshotel and I worked as an advisor on the governance committee of the French Citizens Climate Assembly. And I'm not sure it is for me to say and to evaluate the legacy of the Assembly. The members of the Assembly have had the last meeting in February this year where they had to evaluate the answer that the government offered to their proposals, and the climate law that Alina just mentioned was one of them. This happened in a highly polarized context with many tensions around was the climate law enough or not, etc. And they were quite severe in the evaluation they made. But as Alina pointed, I think that we need more time, that also the assessment of is this climate law enough or not also depends on who is speaking in the French society. But maybe a side effect and something we see is the fact that the government tried to set up another deliberative process organized around the issue of vaccination in January this year. And the process was criticized from the start because the government had not really followed up or was under criticism for the follow-up on the French CCC. And personally, I think that the way the government has managed the answer to the CCC could have been or may be detrimental in the future for those kind of processes. And we see that there are now new processes coming up at local and regional levels. And for many, the CCC was grandiose in a way, very impactful, or it resonated a lot. But in terms of outcome, people really try to, they want to learn from that and to avoid some mistakes that were made. And maybe finally, just a remark, because this goes back to what Frederick was saying on the integration into policy systems. This is also the problem of deliberative systems that you need to integrate to a very top-down process in France. The way we do the decision-making in France is organized in a way where one party can hold all the power. It does not need to collaborate with other parties. And I think that the CCC was something very different because it's based on sort of coalition building and trying to reach consensus without reaching consensus, but trying to get more people to agree with it. And so we need to also have a look at how this questions back policymakers in the way they do policy every day. Thank you.
Thank you, Lise. I have Dimitri Courant and Oisin Coghlan who want to intervene on the French case. We have 2 minutes left. I'll give it to Dimitri first, but I've also seen a very interesting question from Chris Hopkins in the chat. So if we could be brief, Dimitri.
Yeah, yes, hi. So my name is Dimitri Courant. I was one of the researchers observing the Convention Climat, and I also worked on the Irish Citizen Assembly of 2016-2018. I think for the French case, what is interesting to see is that even before the government started to do the cherry picking, most of the people that were the opinion was checked during opinion polls didn't believe that the government would take most on board. They were really skeptical about this even prior, and that's maybe also amplified by the fact that the CCC just happened after the Grand Débat National, which also was the same stuff. Like Macron didn't take on board almost any of the proposition of the Grand Débat, even though he didn't committed to do that in the Grand Débat. But so that would be something to look at, because I heard a lot about it was publicized, people knew about it, but it didn't mean that they think that it would carry an impact in terms of public policies. And the second thing that would be interesting to check a bit more cautiously is like Parliament MPs and ministers, they might say, and they had, that, oh yeah, this would not have been possible without the CCC, or this is a direct input. But I would take that with a grain of salt, because there was a very interesting analysis that was done on studying exactly what was put in the bill and what was not. And what was put in the bill without change was 10% of the proposition. So it's minimalistic. But at the same time, when the CCC was discussing with, for instance, the Minister of the Transition, she said, Ecology, she said, "Oh, we took most of this stuff." So I would compare declaration with implementation.
Dimitri, thank you. So always check what a politician says. It's a very good advice. Oisin, can you be very brief, because
I'll be very brief. And Dimitri may have trumped my thought with his empirical evidence from France, because what I was going to say was, I think it's worth, in terms of checking things and researching things, it's not necessarily the case that the only measure of success of a citizens' assembly is exactly how many of its precise recommendations are taken on board by government. I think Alina was getting at this too. It could also be that the government does do things that it wasn't planning to do before, or does more than it was going to do before. And that's the counterfactual. Dimitri seems to be suggesting they're not doing much more in France than they were going to do already. But it isn't just how is it compared to the 100% of the assembly, but how does it compare to the baseline that they were going to do before the assembly?
Thank you, Oisin, which points to the problem of measurement and having a benchmark for the impact. So interesting. So we have a few minutes left for some final thoughts. I will just read Chris Hopkins' question, and maybe both authors can take it into their final remarks. Maybe would welcome any reflections on potential of climate assemblies in the global south or countries with weaker democratic institutions. It's a very interesting perspective outside our maybe a bit European perspective here. So the floor is, I'll give it first to Alina. You want to?
Thank you. Excellent question, Chris, and a very challenging one. I think that is definitely an area worth looking into. I think climate assemblies have great potential in the global south, and we already have some experience with generally deliberative methods like participatory budgeting on climate change applied in Latin America and some other countries which were quite successful. Again, I think I'll go back to the point made earlier, is I think it depends what the purpose is, what are we trying to kind of solve or to address with the Citizens Assembly, and in particular with political context with weaker democratic institutions, is there support from the authority in charge for that, or are we trying to actually generate social movement to impact the opinion of those in power? So I think one would need to unpack it, but the general answer to me would be yes, absolutely. That is great potential for this as an instrument. And maybe one final point I wanted to make, and I think that slightly touches on this question, but also on the previous discussion. How do we measure success of climate assemblies and their long-term impact? I think it's also about the impact on politicians, on those in power. And that is something that hasn't been researched as much in relation to climate assemblies as yet, according to our findings. But even if some of the recommendations are not picked up by the political process, if climate assembly helps to shift the opinions of parliamentarians, of policymakers, that is also one measure of success. And I think we should devote more attention to that in Knoca going forward. Thank you so much.
Okay, Alina, thank you. Daniel, you have some very few last words here.
Sure, yeah. I think, but going back to the issue of the French example, I would say that it still raised awareness that a deliberative process was engaged with, and even if the government don't follow it, I guess the more that we engage with these types of citizen democracy, then it becomes harder and harder to do that in the future and to ignore it. More and more deliberative processes being in the media means that we can kind of re-establish the role of citizens in creating behaviour change around climate issues. Obviously, that means that it's still challenging when we think of how urgent some of these issues are. But I feel like the overall exposure and validity of the method kind of speaks to its favour. I just wanted to come back to as well a point earlier, which I think is interesting with this. If we're to say that we're generally working towards the encouragement of deliberative democratic methods, these topics of economic growth and capitalism and neoliberalism, which I feel were elephants in the room years ago and then haven't been, and then it was quite interesting that it took a little while to get into it and didn't come up last night. But moving beyond the questions of merely climate change perhaps, and deliberating about how these dominant economic paradigms might be affecting the availability of different forms of agency around climate change and governance. If the deliberative process is kind of useful, then maybe we can apply it to some of these sort of hierarching paradigm issues that we might have.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. Before I leave you into the break, I want to thank all of the speakers, first of all, and our panelists. It's clearly a debate that, also in the chat, I saw a lively discussion on both the UK and the French example. So there's still loads of topics to debate. We didn't even talk about the media, which on the Jamboard I saw was mentioned by a few people. After the break, there is a more interactive part. So for those of you who've been listening a lot, so after the break, there'll be breakout rooms to discuss Knoca going forward. So please stay on for that. The Jamboards will remain open. So if you want to give some advice or topics for these papers going forward, please, you can still do that. And so I think I thank you all for a very lively and interesting debate. Thank you.